Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/JQNA.
I feel like I'm one of those foreigners that doesn't complain about Japan.
The best thing about Japan is also the worst thing.
The nation that is the most like the United States technologically, but the least like the United States culturally.
I'm not sure if that's a good thing or bad thing.
Hello and welcome to JQNA. This week we're changing things up just a bit. This is a combination episode of JQNA Season 1, Episodes 6 and 7, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I'm your host, Catherine. Up until this point, each episode of JQNA has featured one question. Each week, everyone will give you the answer to that question, and then the following week, we move on to the next. But this week is a little bit different. I'm featuring the answers for both episodes 6 and 7 this week because, in many cases, people answered this question together. And I think it's a good thing that they did, which is why I went ahead and included both answers in this episode. If you're wondering what this will mean for next week's episode, be sure to stay until the end of the podcast and I'll give you all the information you want and need. But for now, let's start talking about, well, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I find that most people who are interested in Japan want to know the good and the bad, almost as though there's no in-between. So I decided to ask all of my guests what they thought the best thing and worst thing about Japan was. I got a lot of interesting answers, and I am really looking forward to sharing them with you. But first, like I do with every episode, I'm going to offer up my answers. When I think about the best things Japan has to offer, it's challenging for me to just pick one that I would consider what is best about Japan. There are a lot of good things about Japan, and as I'll discuss in a minute, there's a lot of bad things about Japan. But overall, I think I could say that the thing I think is best about Japan is how common sense some things are. In fact, how common sense many things are. I realize that might not make sense without explanation, so let me do my best to try and explain this for you. Here in Japan, there are a lot of things that, in my opinion, exceed convenience, and that's why I choose to say are common sense, that they are common sense. One great example of this that I bring up often is getting medical attention. I realize that there are a lot of foreigners who are not familiar with what you need to do in order to get medical attention. And it sometimes, in some cases, even concerns them because getting medical attention in a foreign country can be scary. We'll talk more about that at a different time. But overall, as someone who is relatively familiar with how to get what you need taken care of, it's what I would describe as common sense. It's just the way that it should be done, at least in my opinion. When we're talking about medical stuff, if you need to go see a specialist, for example, an ear, nose, and throat doctor, or a dermatologist, or an OBGYN, you can do that by just showing up at a specialist's office. It's not like you have to first go to your family practitioner and then have to have them treat you, and then they can recommend you or refer you to a place. Of course, there are places that require that, special high-end specialists or whatnot, but for the most part, if you have an issue that you need resolved, you can do that without having to jump through all these extra hoops. I mean, you're sick. You just want to be taken care of, right? Common sense. The same is true in other aspects of life. The way that you have to get parking permits so that you can buy a car, and that parking permit shows that you have enough space to park that car. It makes it a lot easier to live in that way. The fact that you can pay bills or make purchases at local convenience stores. And by purchases, I don't mean, what you buy from the convenience store, but you can buy airline tickets and pay for whatever. Even if you don't have a credit card, you can still do all of that stuff at a local convenience store. These are all things that, in my opinion, are the best thing about Japan collectively. This common sense way of doing things. It makes life easier, it makes life more pleasant, and for me, it's just, I can't imagine living a life where it's not like this, even though I know that it's not like this in my home country. On the flip side of this coin are the bad things about Japan, or the negative. And although I very much love living in Japan, and I have plenty of good things to say about living in this country, I have not for 1 minute been under the delusion that Japan is perfect or that nothing bad or negative happens here. That's just not fact. Bad things happen here in Japan, negative things happen here in Japan, but what you will hear from me is that I don't find any one thing that happens in Japan particularly negative or bad versus anywhere else in the world. Maybe it's just my experience. Maybe it's just the way I see things at this point in my life. But I find that Japan overall is a place that has negative things, but they're the same negative things that happen elsewhere. And if people say that they don't happen elsewhere, it's probably because they just don't recognize it wherever they are, or they choose not to see it. I've actually seen many examples of this throughout the years, where I talk to someone who happens to have watched a YouTube video, read a blog, or seen a documentary that emphasizes one thing about Japan that is common all over the world, and yet they think it is Japan specific, and how could Japan do such a thing? Meanwhile, it is a thing everywhere. So in that way, I think it's very challenging to find one specific thing about Japan that is bad, because for me, it would have to be something that you wouldn't find elsewhere. It would have to be a problem that is specifically a problem because of Japan. And I just don't have one. Again, that's not to say that bad things don't happen here, that Japan is perfect or any of that. It's not. But overall, something that Japan does that the United States, in my case, because I'm from the United States, doesn't do. I just don't have one.
The best thing about Japan is also the worst thing, or rather, its strongest point is also its worst point. It's also the weakest point of Japan. It's the harmony in Japan. Okay, what's so good about it? It's, well, even strangers in public, they won't mess up against each other, when they see something happening, like they know how to avoid it, or what to do not to make that stranger's life more difficult. They'll get out of your way. They won't get angry. They won't think that you're doing that on purpose just to make their own lives worse. It's just when they see something happening, let's say like let's say a lot of people are kind of aged in Japan, so they kind of tend to walk slower. Of course, their body is kind of breaking down. So if you have a group of people behind those elderly, they won't get upset that they're walking slow. They're just going to walk around them, and that's it. Because immediately they'll have that understanding that that elderly is not doing that on purpose. The elderly are not trying to make the lives of the pedestrians worse. They're just trying to get where they're trying to go, but they cannot go faster. And people around them understand that. If I would see the same situation, let's say in Canada, people would get pissed off right away. You know, just within like a microsecond, oh, that person walks so slow, and then they kind of get upset, they kind of get irate, and then just like they still walk around those people, but they get upset, they get irate, you know. But here it's like, okay, they don't like this, but it's that big word, right? Shogunai. Nothing that can be done. So nothing can be done. Shogunai. So you just walk around that person and that's it. So it makes, how can I put it, that harmony in Japan makes a society here a stronger net in a way. You know, not trying to step on each other's toes, I would say. And trying like just to be equal to everybody else. But then again, what's the worst thing about it is, well, because of that strong sense of harmony here, people tend to not be outspoken. They won't say what they have on their mind, or they won't really express themselves. They will think that if they're a little bit eccentric, that they cannot show themselves to the public like that. They have to do that somewhere else, somewhere secluded, at some special event. And I understand why this is happening. I just don't understand why they go with it. You know, I wish there would be more Japanese people, more locals here, more outspoken, that they wouldn't feel afraid to express themselves because of that harmony, that sense of harmony that they feel must be preserved here. So yes, I hope that explains why I think harmony in Japan is the best and worst thing about the country.
I guess the best thing is, that it is safe. It is easy to live here, for the most part. Being as it is relatively safe, it's easy to raise kids without having to watch their back every second or worry that something's going to happen to them on the way to school or things like that.